Founded by artist Philip Sanderson, Snatch Tapes launched in 1979 and ran through a critical time during the emergence of the underground tape scene. Using electronic and experimental music as his touchstone, Philip was looking for music that pushed beyond the conventional formulas. The label drew together a circle of musicians that included Lemon Kittens, David Jackman, Nigel Jacklin, and, linking our earlier episode featuring Danny and the Dressmakers, Graham Massey under his Beach Surgeon alias. This is cassette culture. With his curiosity about the potential of warping electronic circuits for sonic purposes, Philip was headed to study at the Goldsmiths University Electronic Music Studio, armed with a handful of circuit-bent devices that he was already using in his duo, Stormbugs.
And on the side of the little Philips cassette thing, rather than jack plugs, they had these DIN sockets, and I would just kind of connect one pin from that to another pin, and then normally some sort of oscillation sound would emerge, and it'd be like, oh, okay. And then you could mess around with that and produce a range of simple things. And I found you could do the same with a transistor radio. So I had a radio which I'd sort of dismantled and sort of attached to a board, and then had put together various wires to key points on the circuit and put in little variable resistors. And so you could twiddle these and produce a kind of range of slightly random electronic noises. And you hear these on the first Stormbugs single, Table Matters. The reel-to-reels that I'd picked up from the local flea market prior to going to Goldsmiths, I did make some tape loops, but it's only when you kind of got to being able to use a Revox. And I managed to get a Revox in about 1979. It was a part valve, part transistor, a big beast of a thing. It could do all sorts of things. So yes, I got heavily into doing tape loops. And there were various other little tricks. And again, you can hear that on some of the Stormbugs, what have you. So yes, it was it was a feast of experimentation.
In 1976, the Goldsmiths Electronic Music Studio quoted an equipment list which included 2 VCS3 synthesizers, an EMS pitch-to-voltage converter, 6 sine wave generators by Hewlett-Packard Leyland, and 3 sine and square wave generators, plus the Astronic octave filter A1671. Access to this equipment alongside Philip's existing tape loop and electronic experiments would give Stormbugs and Snatch Tapes the ingredients to create their futuristic sound.
Sort of takes us through into early '79 when I got the idea to do the first Snatch tape. And Snatch 1 comes out, and I think by then there's a sort of network slowly beginning to emerge. I think there was this idea around, particularly if like yourself, you weren't really a musician. If everything you did was effectively recording, you might conjure a number of names. So Stormbugs was one of a few names. Vote Police was a short-lived name. And then, of course, there's the Claire Thomas and Susan Veze pseudonym, which I came up with for a short time. It was very much less of being a band. Certainly for Snatch 1, we had already received a few tapes from different people. The people who were on there's the N4s, Carl Emptybody, I don't know how many tapes we got by then, but, enough to put something together. By 1980, when we did Snatch 2, by then I was living in Paddington, which was quite useful. It was a sort of quite close to the station, Paddington Station, in central-ish London. And people would just drop by then.
By 1980, fanzines, including Throbbing Gristle's own Industrial News, would review tape releases and list the contact details of the artists. But the major UK music press were quick to launch their own dedicated columns to cover the emerging tape scene.
People like to mention the Throbbing Gristle Industrial News tapes received. That has a list of all the tapes that aspirant people sent TG. And it's kind of roll call. I mean, you've got Clock DVA, Rima, Cabaret Voltaire. I mean, Stormbugs and Vote Police are in there. Key to the 1980 period was when big music papers, Sounds, Enemy in particular, started running their DIY corner and garage land. And as soon as anything was published in there, just an address, you would start receiving tapes. At that time, you have to remember that the post service was super hyper. So there could be up to 3 deliveries of post a day. So you'd get your morning one, there'd be one around lunchtime, and then sometimes one at 3 o'clock. So, there'd be the various jiffy bags coming through the door and letters and things. Because that was the thing. If someone sent you, they expected a letter back. It was very time-consuming. I had time to consume, but yeah, you could spend a lot of the day replying to the letters and obviously listening to the tape, because people wouldn't send you one track, they'd send you a whole tape. And then if you wanted to pick a track for the Snatch 2, I remember we had a lot of tapes.
One of the people who was drawn to the experimental focus of Snatch was Jeff Rushton, later to be known as John Balance, founder of Coil. But at this point, editor of Stab Mental fanzine and mentor and occasional lyricist for a young band from Oxfordshire called Cultural Amnesia. Here's the recollection of Gerard Greenway from the band.
Jeff Rushton, latterly John Balance, was extremely important to Cultural Amnesia. He was 3 years older than us, and it was him who introduced us to the tape scene. And throughout the 3 years that we were first active, essentially took on the role of manager and publicist, arranging nearly all of our releases, both albums and compilation contributions. Jeff was exceptionally energetic as a young man, and he had these connections because of his fanzine of Stab Mental. The contribution to Snatch 2 was Cultural Amnesia's first compilation appearance. Jeff organised it for us. It was very early on for us as a band. And the track featured on Snatch 2, Cyberforms 1, is amongst our earliest recordings, dating from early 1980. And as the numeral indicates, there is in fact a Cyberforms 2, which features Ben on the treated piano and me playing a metal detector, or the oscillator, as it was credited. Both tracks were released on our first cassette album, Video Radio, in the summer of 1981 on con tapes, conventional tapes. And that was run by Anthony Clough, a contributor to Snatch 1, who was also associated with the London-based band The Door and the Window. But Philip added some echo at points. We had very limited instrumental resources at this very early stage of the band. Philip must have told you, yes, we were disconcerted by his manipulation of the track. Having listened to the compilation again for the first time in very many years, it might be argued that the addition of echo improves the piece. Obviously, Philip thought so. But at the time, we were not pleased about what had been done without consultation.
treating each of the compilations as an artistic composition to be mixed and composed with liberty was a hallmark of the Snatch Tape style. Philip added orchestral interludes and processed some of the tracks as he wished. Meanwhile, one of Philip's pseudonyms attracted the attention of the Cherry Red label, who included music credited to Claire Thomas and Susan Vasey as the lead track on the Perspectives and Distortion LP in 1981. The compilation also featured music from the Lemon Kittens, David Jackman, Robert Fripp, There's Matt Johnson, and Isla Singaza. Cherry Red were keenly interested to know if this female electronic duo might have more material for a full album release.
Okay, so essentially putting together Snatch 1, and as I say, we had a small number of tapes to draw from. I had a reluctance to putting things under my own name. I was looking through the paper and I plucked two names. The scene at that time was just 99.9% male. So, this was an all-male scene. So this idea that there were, even people who are now widely celebrated, like Delia Derbyshire, who did the Doctor Who theme, had the radiophonic workshop. These were kind of very unknown names. Daphne Oram, nobody had heard of Daphne Oram, who was Delia Derbyshire's predecessor. So it was a little bit like a provocation. Come 1980, similarly, we had a Stormbugs release, Safe Substitute, and then I conjured up these other tracks, which were using the tape delay system. But I was trying to do something slightly different. So with the tape delay, but I had this idea, well, what happens if you put rhythms into it? And how would they kind of overlay on each other? So I've done these couple of long tracks. And so I wheeled out the Claire Thomas and Susan Vasey name again and came up with this spoof little narrative, how they would be walking across Blackheath in flowing robes and then fitting with their synthesizers. But it was one of the tapes which then went onto the display board at Rough Trade, and Mike Allway, who was the Cherry Reds, he was a young A&R guy, and he bought these cassettes from Rough Trade, and he said, "Oh, this is brilliant. I'd like to release all of these," he said, on vinyl. And we were like, okay, this sounds good. And he said, "Oh, I'm particularly interested in Claire Thomas and Susan Vasey." And I was like, okay. And really, at that point, I should have been up front and said, "Look, this is, it's me. It's just me." But I didn't say that at that point. And he was then becoming more insistent, saying, "Well, I'd love to meet them." And I said, "Oh, they're in America doing some work on the theatre, performance art, all that crap." And it was getting more and more insistent. And at the time, in the flat in Paddington, a friend of a friend, she was staying in the flat over the summer. She was also a chorister. And I think one evening I said, "Oh, do you want to just record a few phrases into a microphone?" Anyway, that went on the tape. And of course, that added credence, despite the fact the rest of the tape is this kind of electronic music, the singing added credence to the existence of this couple. And so once Mike Allway had pestered me enough, I said to Nancy, who was still living in the flat at this point, I said, "Well, maybe you should go and meet him." So she was like, okay. And off she goes. And despite the fact she didn't look like a pre-Raphaelite knob twiddler, he was completely taken in. And I think he thought, we'll dump Sanderson and Snatch Tapes and offer her some kind of contract. So after about the third time he invited her out, he'd taken her to see Quentin Crisp, who was briefly a Cherry Red artist. She, in the end, after a long evening, blurted out that no, she wasn't either Claire Thomas or Susan Vasey, so she was the singer, Nancy, on the track. And I got a very grumpy phone call from Mike the following day. The Perspectives and Distortion was well underway, but obviously it put the kibosh on what, if anything, had these planned LP releases never, of course, materialised. Yeah, he felt he'd been led up the garden path. And I suppose he had.
Falling foul of the youthful pranksterism of the time, the follow-up release never happened. But we can't help wonder what could have happened if Claire and Susan had gone on to have that cherry red LP release.
The other thing, of course, was that when I moved to Paddington, Rough Trade was about a 20-minute, half-an-hour walk away, and they stopped the cassettes. It was great. They'd take the cassettes on a sale or turn basis. But with the records, at that point, Rough Trade, I mean, they were trying to support the independent sector. And basically, if you released something and you took it down there, and it was an independent DIY release, they would take 25 copies without listening to it. If there's 25 copies sold, they would then ask you for more, but they paid you there and then. So we sold a few. The single, this would be the Table Matters single here. He's just holding up a copy. At some point, I went in, do you want some more copies? And they said that they had some sort of branch in the US. Anyway, they said, we've heard the single somehow. We'd like 50 copies of that. So they said, well, what price would you like? I upped the price a bit because, as was always the case, you were kind of running in debt. And 50 copies winged their way off to the US, which I think then found their way into various people's record collections. With Snatch 2, the address Westbourne Terrace, it was in Paddington, had been published a few times. So then people, would send you stuff or, as I say, turn up. So when David Jackman rocked up, I was just putting the Snatch 2 together. And I said, do you want to give us a hand, as it were? And he said, sure. And it was that kind of spirit of, let's try anything. The Lemon Kittens, who I think were still coming and going between Reading, which is where Carl Blake's parents lived, they would drop by. I mean, not every day or anything, on occasions, because they would come through Paddington, and it was a 5-minute walk from the mainline station. Nigel Jacklin, who was later of Alien Brains fame, he did a number of tapes. I can't remember if what was then to become the New Blockaders came, because they'd already written to me, so I'd already had some correspondence with them, but they were quite friendly with Nigel Jacklin, and I think came to stay with him a couple of times, and we'd all meet up. And 2 or 3 years afterwards, there was a gig, which was myself, David Jackman, Nigel Jacklin, and the Rupenus brothers. We did this gig. It's in this old school building.
Through these spontaneous meetings, Philip had become part of an extended collective of musicians who, alongside Nigel Jacklin, became known as Alien Brains. Nigel stressed to us they were not a band, had no fixed lineup, wrote no songs, used no words, and conveyed no meaning. Here are Nigel's recollections of the performance at the time.
We also performed at the Centro Iberico, an old abandoned Victorian school on the Harrow Road in London, where Throbbing Gristle and Whitehouse had previously played. The building was squatted by some Spanish anarchists, and it was near where I lived, so I just went in one day and asked if we could play there. This time, Alien Brains comprised of myself, Richard and Philip Rupenus, Neil Purvis and Philip Sanderson. This was among our most sparsely attended performance, due to the fact that there had hardly been any advertising whatsoever, apart from a small mention in the magazine Time Out. Stephen Stapleton and John Fothergill of Nurse with Wound were among the few who attended. Steve was rather curious about the walkie-talkie system we'd set up as part of a cobbled-together PA. An excerpt from this performance was included on the British Interiors cassette. We also contributed to several compilation cassettes, including Snatch 3, Snatch Tapes.
There were all these semi-abandoned buildings in London still. Quite hard to imagine now, but abandoned Victorian buildings, abandoned schools, swimming pools, old factories. And normally the security was like non-existent. Some kids would have made a hole around the back and you could go in, and we would do the odd thing whereby, just with whatever was there, gas pipes, but it was a kind of form of improvisation, not dissimilar to kind of things that the blockaders did on some of their seminal recordings, dragging a table across the floor to get those kind of squeaky, screechy sounds that we know and love. Yes. At this point, Cherry Red have put out the Perspectives and Distortion LP, which included the Claire Thomas and Susan Bosley track and a Jackman track, Untitled. And the second Stormbug single had come out in 81. So there was stuff happening. We did Snatch 3 in 81. And for some reason, we decided, we're going to just make this more professional. I'm not quite sure why we made that decision, but where previously the covers had all been photocopied, in this case, we decided we're going to print the cover. And that added all sorts of problems. So when you're printing things at that time, you had to have them typeset, which was a long-winded and expensive process. I remember it had to be typeset twice because I got someone to do it for free in the graphics department, and one of the names had been misspelt. So we said, okay, we better sort that out, I suppose. And then we did a poster. Poster was great fun. It was a silk screen. There was a workshop in Deptford, and you could go in. There were silk screen workshops all over. In fact, they were a kind of community resource. Each borough had a silk screen workshop. So you go in there. So we did a poster, did some coloured labels. Anyway, it became something rather than something that was bashed out in a month. It took like 3 or 4 months, of course, but it took a long time.
After an intense 3 years running the label, releasing Stormbug's material and his other projects, Philip had decided he wanted to pass on the legacy of Snatch Tapes for someone else to run.
I'd spent a lot of time making these tape loops. What I was trying to do was what's now called granular synthesis. So I had this idea about how you could actually stretch sounds out by taking little fragments of them, making them into loops, playing them back and then re-recording them and building them up like this. Now, this is sort of project really you should be trying to do at the research centre at the Pompidou or something, not in a 20th floor of a tower block. So I'd spent a good 6 months on this. I had a room just full of tape loops. And I think as I came to the end of 1981, I just thought, I need to move on from this. And so I said to David, who'd been very much a sort of peripheral member of the Snatch Tapes thing, I said, do you want to take this over? And he went, oh, okay. But he never really had any commitment to putting together compilations. So we did a couple more tapes. He did a couple of, now very hard to get hold of, solo tapes. They were like cassette singles on Snatch Tapes. And then he decided to launch his own Aeroplane label, cassette label. And then we do this release in 82, I think, no, maybe 82, 83, which he put on his Aeroplane things, but could almost be considered a Snatch release because it picks up on recordings that had been made 2 or 3 years earlier. Quite why it wasn't put out earlier, I don't know. I mean, I was still in touch with Nigel, Alien Brains Nigel, and he did the Verdansk Gang tape, which came out in 83, 84, something like that. 1980 was probably the peak Snatch Tapes day. And in many ways, it was a peak for cassettes being overground. By being published in the NME, which after circulation was 50,000, even if they just did a short review, and some of their reviews were quite flippant. And so there was that level of exposure. It was a short moment, I think, 79, 80, 81, where it looked like this was going to become an alternative channel of music distribution. Now, that sounds a little bit utopian, and it probably was. I think Snatch Tapes was lucky in getting there. We were just probably a little bit earlier than quite a lot of people, maybe a year or so ahead of the game. As the 80s wore on and we get into the full Thatcher thing, I'm less convinced that it was so groovy. I mean, there was a lot of activity in the 80s, but, without wanting to turn overly political, I think there was a lot of creative talent wasted in the 1980s in the UK because of everything being shut down and there being, people were forced in a sense to do their own projects and become DIY because the opportunities for getting into the creative sector, shall we call it, were incredibly limited. But on the whole, there were very few opportunities in the 80s. So as that decade wore on, I think it became, also one's moving to one's 20s, you're not really worried about anything more than tomorrow when you're about 19, are you? It's what's happening tomorrow. That's the key, isn't it?
And with the foundations laid that proved that anyone with an idea could take up the DIY formula of a label, a distributor, or a fanzine, they most certainly did make their own opportunities in the 80s. In this episode of the Cassette Culture Podcast, you heard from me, Martin Franklin, with Philip Sanderson. The words of Gerard Greenway were read by Sean Holland. The words of Nigel Jacklin were read by Robert Hayes. The music you heard was Call by Orior on Snatch 3. Window Shopping by the Stormbugs from the Table Matters single. Hodge by Stormbugs from A Safe Substitute. N4S from the Snatch 1 compilation. Cultural Amnesia Dub from the Snatch 2 compilation. Ashes and Diamonds by Claire Thomas from Snatch 3. Reprint 2 by Claire Thomas and Susan Vasey from Reprint. Solely From by Stormbugs from A Safe Substitute. Untitled by Alien Brains on the British Interiors tape. Song by Nigel Jacklin from Snatch 3. Under Press of Sail by Claire Thomas and Susan Vasey on Snatch 1. Bright Waves by Claire Thomas and Susan Vasey from Reprint. All tracks released by Snatch Tapes, apart from British Interiors by Alien Brains.